Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. So glad you're joining us. We're continuing leadership lessons from the life of David, the giant killer, and one of Israel's greatest kings. In fact, I think the greatest king in all of Israel's history, next to Jesus, the King of Kings. In fact, David is often a type and shadow of Jesus, the King of Kings. Now, 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 38, we see, so Saul clothed David in his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not yet tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, I have not tested them. So David took them off. Saul put his armor on David. David tried it on and realized, hey, this doesn't fit me. This isn't the right size for me. And secondly, I haven't proven these. I haven't tried these out. So here's some leadership principles inside of this moment here. First, David knew something about risk management. Never make a major decision with something that's untested and unproven. Don't bet the farm on an unproven armor, on an unproven system, unproven principle, unproven program. Be very careful when you're making major life bets. For example, had David failed on this mission, it would have cost him his life. So David used some very good judgment going, I haven't tried this out. I'm going to stick with what I know and with what is proven effective for me. There's a difference between risks and recklessness. See, I like what General Patton said. He said, take calculated risks. That's quite different from being rash. There's risk in everything that we do, but you can mitigate risk when you take calculated risks. And that's what we see inside of the life of David. The second thing we learn is this, that there is not a one-size-fits-all for leadership success. Saul could have gone to teach at a seminar and talk about how his armor was part of what made him great. And there would be people who would show up to that seminar and go, wow, what I need to buy is a replica of Saul's armor because that's what makes Saul great. Well, Saul's armor doesn't fit everybody. And a lot of people go to conferences and seminars. You go to a church growth seminar, you go to this seminar on how to run business, and you go, wow, I need that formula or I need that program. But you often take that and bring it back and try to apply it to your company and your context or your church, and you realize, hey, it doesn't fit me. It's not working. Here's what we should be looking for. Don't look for formulas, look for factors. Don't look for formulas, look for factors, and don't look for programs as much as you're looking for principles. So focus on principles over programs, factors over formulas. When I started Element Church over 15 years ago, I had spent 15 years prior to that in a large church context in a Bible Belt city. So I moved to St. Louis to plant this church that's inside of my heart, thinking I'm going to do a lot of what I did in a Bible Belt city. Well, I moved to St. Louis, and it's a very different city, very different context. It's not Bible Belt, and I get here and realize, hey, a lot of the things that I thought this is how every church needs to do church, I realize not every single thing is going to apply into my particular city and into my particular context. And so I went quickly to go, I need to learn my community, our people, the people God's calling us to reach, and I can apply principles that might have worked. I can apply factors that might have worked, but I can't just cookie cutter a program. I can't cookie cutter a church methodology because it's not the same context. And the same might be for you in whatever it is God's put in your heart to do. Learn from others, gather from others. We read books, we go to conferences, we listen to great podcasts like this, but we modify it for the context where we are. I used to get to go fly fishing. I don't really get to go as much as I like to. I'm a little farther from a good trout stream than I'd like to be. But when I was learning to trout fish, there was a gentleman that was very successful there. Every time I'd show up, I'd see him. He was just catching trout nonstop. Well, I'm a newbie at this, and I wasn't catching nothing but some snags and losing some lures, and so some flies. So I go to the gentleman. I go, "Would you tell me what it is you're using that's working so good?" And he goes, "Well, I'm using this particular woolly burger. Would be a certain fly that he might be using." I go, "Oh, great!" So I'd find that in my tackle, and I'd throw that out there, and all of a sudden, sure enough, man, I'd just start catching fish, and I'm like, "This is awesome." Well, next week when I showed up, I didn't catch nothing using the exact same thing, and he wasn't there. So I'm like, well, I don't know what to do now. I remember going that entire day catching nothing. Well, the next week when I went back, he was there, and so he was catching fish again. And I go, well, what's working for you? And he showed me, and it was different than what he'd showed me that one time. And so I learned something. I said, why did you choose that versus the other thing that you told me last time? And he goes, well, the weather today is this temperature. It's cooler. And there's also a particular hatch that's taking place. So that's why I chose this. So what I did is I moved beyond, hey, what program's working for you? What formula is working for you to tell me why? I went to the factor. I went to the principle. What he really did is he taught me how to fish. Now, because I learned some principles when he wasn't there, now I knew what to choose to use, and I grew much more effective at catching fish because I went beyond what and I went down to the why. So when you're learning from another leader, don't just ask, hey, what are you guys doing for this? What are you doing for customer retention? What are you doing for follow-up? Ask why you are doing that and listen to the why behind it, because that's what you're really going to learn the most from. The third thing we see is this: you're anointed to be you, and you're not anointed to be anybody else. David could not step into Saul's anointing because that was not how God anointed David. So David had to be true to himself. He had to be true to the original in which God made him. And really, he probably felt a little out of place because David is a shepherd. He's showing up on a battlefield full of a bunch of warriors who are clothed in warriors armor, and they got all their stuff that goes with battle. David's got a loincloth, a slingshot, a shepherd's pouch, and a stick called a staff. So he probably looked a little funny. In fact, we know this: Goliath actually laughed at him when he saw him. And there are times when you're just who God made you to be that you don't fit in. You do stand out. You don't look like every other business, every other company. You don't look like every other pastor or every other church or every other volunteer. And so there are just times you're going to stand out, but you have to become comfortable with who God made you to be. You are a great you. You're a lousy somebody else. Steve Jobs, when you look at the late Steve Jobs, he kind of broke the mold because in business, the CEO had the power suit and had the power tie, and there's Steve Jobs in his black power turtleneck. And every time you see Steve Jobs, he showed up in a totally different attire. Now, he did actually change a lot of what was acceptable inside of CEO standards, which I'm grateful for. I'm teaching this podcast right now in a pair of shorts and a nice polo and tennis shoes. I'm comfortable. So thank you. You're welcome. I've had to learn this for me personally, that it's easy to want to look at another pastor because I'm a pastor. It's easy to look at, well, that's how that pastor is, or that's how they teach. That's how they communicate. That's how they do things. And then you start to feel odd because, I'm not quite like that. I don't quite talk that way. I don't quite communicate that way. I'm more intense than that person, or I'm not as intense as that person. I'm not as funny as that person, or I'm a little too funny, or whatever it is that we could all get insecure about. See, here's the hard part about comparing yourself with other people. There is no one else like you. So if you're looking for affirmation and security by looking at the norm, the problem is this: you're not going to find you out there. If you're truly being faithful to who God made you to be, you can't find another you. So if you're looking for validation that you're okay because you're like every other pastor, every other business leader, every other manager, you're never going to find it, because if you're truly who God made you to be, there's not a normal standard out there of you. So you have to be comfortable in who God made you to be, as long as it's in the context of Scripture. Matthew 3:17, Jesus is getting baptized in the Jordan River. The heavens open up, and the Father says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. All the validation and affirmation that Jesus needed, he got from the Father. Why? Because he couldn't get it from anybody else, because there was only one Jesus. So if he looked around and go, well, what do all the other messiahs look like? There are no other legitimate messiahs. He had to get his affirmation from the Father. There are no other legitimate yous that are the benchmark of what you are exactly supposed to be, look like, and do. So look to God, look to his word, and be who God made you to be. Thanks for joining us for this episode. Would you do me a favor, share this with some friends? And then also feel free to write us. I'd love to hear from you. How's this podcast helping you? I'd love to know where you're from and any questions that you might want us to address in some future podcasts. Would love to get those from you as well. God bless you. Have a great week. See you next time.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.